Welcome, everybody, to the second episode of the All Time High podcast. My name is General Mort, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about how blockchain is going to change the world. And that's going to happen in a variety of ways. But, of course, first things first, let's go through a little bit of the highlights from this past week. A lot of stuff happened this week, actually. A lot of really, really exciting news. So, obviously, beginning of the week, the news that everybody was talking about. Tesla has made the decision to purchase $1.5 billion of Bitcoin, which is a massive investment. And this is really important because I think it's going to give a lot of credibility to the space, and people are going to start following Elon and all these other different institutional investors into buying Bitcoin as a Federal Reserve currency, not Federal Reserve, as a reserve asset. Additionally, CME Group launched Ethereum futures on Monday, which is a really exciting time because this means that more institutional investors are going to get involved. The St. Louis Federal Reserve issued a paper on decentralized finance. It's got a lot of really great information. It's kind of a tough read, though, if I'm being honest. So if you can find the highlights, that's a good place to start. Thank you for the follow, Hannah Donnell. So MasterCard is also going to start allowing merchants to accept crypto very soon. They haven't really released too many details on that, but it's another really good sign. Although, I am a little curious on kind of how that's going to work because MasterCard makes all their money on like transaction fees and stuff. So I'm not really sure how they're going to structure that payment model, but nevertheless, it's good for more merchants to get involved and start accepting crypto as an actual currency and as payment. Additionally, PayPal is also going to be adding crypto to Venmo in the first half of 2021. So this is all just a really, good sign for adoption, for people to start getting involved, at least testing the waters. And then lastly, Miami recently announced, or the Miami mayor, that they're going to start allowing government employees to receive compensation in BTC and other cryptocurrencies and whatnot. So that's really cool because I think that's going to introduce a much more traditional style of introduction to those people. Thank you guys for the follows. I am going to turn off the alert box. I thought I turned it off, the audio, but it doesn't look like that's working. So, but thank you guys so much. All right, so let's get into it. So, basically, I think blockchain is going to change the world in a lot of ways. And how that's going to happen is more than likely going to come through a process called infrastructure inversion. Now, this is a concept that I have learned about and studied from Andreas Antonopoulos. Oh, that looks bad. Oh, geez. And the essential concept is that as time goes on, humanity seems to continually create these new technologies. And every time there's a new technology that's kind of bleeding edge or cutting edge, we try and stick it on something that's already existing. And that creates a lot of resistance. And ultimately, that technology has to break away and create its own infrastructure in order to be successful. So, when that disruptive technology creates resistance, at least in the context of Bitcoin, I think what's going to happen is first, the banks are going to resist. And that's already kind of happening. And then they will adopt. And then the banks are going to use blockchain to do their own payment stuff. And then eventually, we're not going to use the banks. That's actually what I think is going to happen. The banks will become decentralized and open, and there'll be trustless ledgers that everybody can participate in and be a part of. So, ultimately speaking, what's going to happen is there's going to be this new infrastructure for blockchain technology, and that is going to lead to new technologies, stuff that we can't even think of. And that, to me, is actually one of the most exciting things about being a part of the space right now, is that I see what's on the horizon, and it's exciting. But all the stuff that I can't see is even more exciting to me. So I'm obviously really bullish on the space, and I think that there's going to be a lot of really cool stuff coming down the road. But I want to talk a little bit more about infrastructure inversion and why I think it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. And to start off, let's take some examples of how this has already happened in the past, right? So one of the first and best examples I think there is the road. So when if you go back way back in time, obviously everybody used to use horses. And all the roads were dirt roads. We didn't have paved roads, so horses were the primary mode of transportation. And when the car came along, everybody kind of hated it. Everybody's like, why would we use these loud, noisy machines when we have perfectly good horses that can get us from point A to point B? And this was a widely held sentiment. And not to mention, the car was loud, it was noisy, and it used gas. And what the hell was gas? Where are we gonna get gas? There's no gas stations. You know, so people were kind of not super stoked on the car initially. And as things went on, people started to develop more, paved roads for the car. And then suddenly the car became a lot more viable. So that is an example of kind of how that infrastructure was built to support this new coming technology. So the old technology, being the dirt roads, was not sufficient for the car. The cars would get stuck in the mud, and they weren't able to work correctly, and certain roads they couldn't handle. So there was a lot of limited capability to the car early on, right? But later on down the line, when we got the road, something really cool happened. This wasn't just for cars. Suddenly we had skateboards and segways and all kinds of different things that had wheels that were now able to work on the road. These things were never previously possible because there wasn't an infrastructure, there wasn't a way for them to work. So the road kind of not only allowed the car to come to the forefront of the transportation industry, but also paved the way for new technologies to get involved. So that's just one example. Another one, the internet. This is actually one of my favorite examples, and I think one of the ones that most closely ties to blockchain. So when the internet was launched on, dial-up. It was slow, it was clunky, and it didn't work well. So people thought it sucked. People basically saw the internet and were like, what's the point? Like, what are we even going to do with this? I can't use the phone while I use the internet. I'm sure if you guys are old enough, you would remember the shitty dial-up tone because you're trying to connect to the internet, which means you couldn't talk to anybody. And the most you could do was like maybe email, maybe some rudimentary forums back in the day. But the internet was mostly kind of free reign at this time. Nobody really knew what was going on, and they didn't really see where it was going. And this is kind of what's really exciting is we all know where the internet eventually went. But to get there, we had to basically convince everybody that this was a better solution for, theoretically, everything. It started out with email and forums and whatnot, but it grew to be so much more. So dial-up was a lot like running a car on a dirt road. Phone lines were not built to support internet connections. They weren't built to support that kind of data. So we were trying to cram all this data through these tiny phone lines, and it just was completely inefficient and it didn't work very well. So until we got to like broadband and DSL, that's when things really started to change. So once that infrastructure was built, it was like giving tools to a bunch of people to make stuff, which was really cool. So now we started to see all these new technologies kind of come online. So I think this exact concept is happening right before our eyes. So let's talk about a little bit what the current infrastructure is like and why it's incomplete and whatnot. So right now we're trying to squeeze crypto on top of the existing banking system, right? we basically can only interact with cryptocurrency. We can buy it and use it and sell it via our banks. Our banks are the ones who are allowing us to make those transactions, and ultimately, they can say no. They can just stop us. Back in 2017, when I started getting involved in all of this, one really common problem people were running into is that their banks were banning them from buying Bitcoin or buying cryptocurrency. And some people were forced to move to different banks. If you were starting a business that was involved in cryptocurrency, it was actually impossible to get a bank account. I know that firsthand because when I started my mining farm, nobody would nobody would let me open an account because it was too risky. So my point is that we are still relying on the banks to let us kind of participate, and that's a problem. So in the context of Bitcoin, becoming unbanked as a part of that infrastructure inversion is no longer counting on those centralized systems to allow us to make those transactions, to allow us to spend our money the way that we want. And we're no longer going to be relying on that old infrastructure that's slow and inefficient and takes 3 to 5 days for payments to settle, and they can tell you whether or not you can and can't buy something. So right now we're driving cars in a horse-driven society. We are trying to make something work when the supporting infrastructure isn't quite there yet. So to me, that makes me really bullish about the future because I can just see that there is so much more coming that I don't even know about. And watching the technology change over the past several years and seeing, decentralized finance explode is really, really encouraging because it means that people are interested enough to basically use a rough version. They're willing to beta test it because they believe in it. So the fact that there's so much money and there's so much involvement right now is a really, really good sign. So even though that we're kind of built on top of this shitty infrastructure, the tools are there. Like a kid with crayons and a piece of paper, people are starting to create innovative, imaginative things. Some things that I think none of us would have ever even thought of. I never would have conceived that there could be some sort of like decentralized finance aggregator that's going to earn me the highest yield on my money 24/7 by moving it in and out of different protocols. Like that, I never would have thought of that. So at the base level, we're talking about essentially building a world where cryptocurrency can kind of run free. We can exchange it and use it and transfer it to each other without any intermediary, without counting on somebody to let us, use our money the way that we want. But I think there are more levels to this. I think this is the fundamental concept for the infrastructure inversion, but I kind of feel like there's like a second part to it. So if we go one level deeper, and we talk about just blockchain in itself, Bitcoin can't really support all of the coming change. You've heard me mention this in the past, but Bitcoin is really built to do one thing. It's built to transact value from point A to point B, and that's kind of it. It's supposed to be direct, moderately cheap, and kind of fast, at least compared to traditional banking standards. It is. But we're going to require vast amounts of data to be transferred instantly at low costs. And this kind of goes far beyond even DeFi and all that stuff. So like I said, Bitcoin struggles because it just has an inferior design. You've got high transaction fees, you have a small block size, you can't fit a whole lot of transactions in, and there's long confirmation times. So this is not going to be efficient for the world where we do need to exchange data instantly. So even Ethereum, relatively speaking, can be kind of slow and expensive, and this is a big problem plaguing the space right now. You have really high gas fees, and some of the transactions take a little bit longer than they should, and people aren't going to be willing to pay fees that are significantly higher than what they're trying to transact. If I want to send $1 to somebody, I'm not going to pay $5. If I'm going to send $1 to somebody, I probably don't even want to pay $1 to do that. I probably want to pay a couple cents. So while that's where Ethereum is ultimately hopefully heading, right now it's not where it is. So this makes it really hard to acquire and engage new users because people are going to be easily turned away when they try and get involved in the process and say, I don't understand it. It's too complicated. It's too confusing, and it's too easy to fuck up. It's too easy to make a mistake. And trust me, I know, because I've made them. So While I think Ethereum has a lot of potential for the future, I really do. I have to see it kind of figure out some of these scaling issues in order to kind of really, really push us to the future. So I want to come back to Ethereum, but first I want to talk about why we really need this new infrastructure. So you might think the internet is fine. The internet is already really cool. But the problem is there's too much control. There are too many centralized parties that can determine who can access what information that you can publish. The internet is kind of dumb by comparison when you compare it to blockchain technology. Like Bitcoin, the internet sends data from point A to point B. You interact with a centralized server and you receive data from them, right? So you have centralized, a centralized server. This is the internet. And you interact between that and the user. So these people are controlling the speed of that connection, controlling how efficient it is, how expensive it is, everything. And you go above this, the people who own, DNS and name servers, whatnot, these people also have a lot of control. And ultimately, there is governments can seize IP addresses and stuff. Sometimes you try and go to a website and it'll say that the government is taking it down. Now, I'm not saying that they're always wrong for doing that, but really what we're going to need is something that is completely open. Something that's censorship resistant, right? So what's coming next, in my opinion, is way bigger than the internet. We have a growing need for decentralized applications as well, or rather what they also call Web 3.0. And Web 3.0 is basically what it sounds like. This is the next evolution of the internet. So, what do we need to have an evolution of the internet? Well, we're going to need a network that is decentralized. This means it's not owned by any company or single entity or body. We need something that is censorship resistant. So, Twitter can't come along and say you can't tweet that. Twitch can't ban you and say that you did something stupid in your stream. YouTube can't demonetize your entire platform because they didn't like something you said. We're talking about something that's truly open and free and hopefully regulated by the community. If you're truly being a bad actor, the community more than likely shun you. But we don't really allow for this currently. I mean, kind of do, but not entirely. And then lastly, we need something that's permissionless. In other words, nobody can restrict access. So, these three things, decentralized, censorship resistant, and permissionless, are the core components of 3.0 and the decentralized applications of the future. This is going to be really important, not just from a social perspective and from a financial perspective, but from a data perspective. Our data currently is not owned by us. This changes that. This allows us to suddenly become in control of our data and hopefully able to monetize it ourselves. I think one thing that people are really frustrated about when we talk about data and Facebook and Google and how they track you, what they're doing, is that I think there would be a different sentiment if you directly benefit from it, other than just getting like targeted advertisements. People might be willing to more sell that data if they're actually going to profit from it. One interesting example of this is the basic attention token and the Brave browser. When you browse the internet using the Brave browser, they'll serve you ads and actually pay you in basic attention token in order for seeing those ads. It's a little bit of a different concept. In other words, instead of paying an ad exchange, an intermediary to serve those ads, they're directly paying you. So when you directly benefit from the process, I think the sentiment is a lot different. So because we're going to need Web 3.0 and everything, we also need to prepare for the coming Internet of Things. This is a fairly new concept, but this is basically the idea that every device in the world with a chip in it will need to interact. So this thereby creates an entirely new type of economy where all of your devices interact with each other, share data, and you might ultimately profit from this. So basically, we're talking about data ownership in the Internet of Things, which will need to support nanotransactions. And what does this mean? This is basically a transaction on the network that's probably going to cost maybe less than a penny. That's greater than. Oops. So basically, if let's say I have a thermometer in my backyard, and I want to sell that data to, I don't know, maybe it's maybe it's a weather company. They're trying to predict the weather, and I'm going to sell my barometer, my thermometer data to them constantly, so they can constantly be reading, from different nodes, and you might get paid out for that. You might get paid because those people are borrowing and using your data. So this is basically the idea of what they call the machine-to-machine economy. So your different devices might be reporting weather, road conditions, interacting with the world autonomously. They're actually working on this. There's a project called IOTA that I'll talk a little bit about in a little bit, that is basically having cars that constantly report stuff like road conditions, traffic, etc. And they do all this stuff automatically, and they can even interact with the world and, let's say, service themselves or get gas completely autonomously. And this is important because, as we move closer to driverless cars and more automated processes, we're going to need ways for those things to actually do things by themselves, right? So in this scenario, your car could go out and rideshare for you during the day while you're at work, and you might make money, generate passive income that way. And while it's out, it can go and get gas for itself, and if it needs to go to service, it can. This is kind of crazy. This is kind of a really radically different concept from what we currently know. I don't think this is going to happen anytime super soon, but this is something to keep in mind for the next 5 to 10 years. So obviously this infrastructure will be built on the internet initially. We do need the internet to interact somewhat, but in this case, you might see a world where you have something like a decentralized internet actually built off of these machines talking to each other. So some sort of like mesh network, something like that. So where is all this headed? What networks can possibly support this coming change? I think Ethereum is going to be probably the front runner to get started on a lot of these things, especially with regards to Web 3.0 and decentralized applications. I think it's absolutely where things are headed. And then there are alternate projects like Cardano or IOTA that are building separate smart contract platforms that are built to do slightly different things. But I do think these platforms can coexist. I don't think you have to pick one and hope that that's the one that wins out in the end. I think all these different platforms are going to have their own purpose. So just like countries have their own currencies and trading platforms and social media or communication, etc., I think that the same thing is going to happen. There will be different smart contract platforms that service different things, maybe geographically speaking, or maybe more related to industry. For example, I think IOTA is much more geared towards this concept, geared towards the machine-to-machine economy and automated cars, stuff like that, because I think that's where their technology lends itself best. IOTA is a different kind of what they call DLT, and this stands for distributed ledger technology. So blockchain would be one DLT, and then IOTA's DLT technology they call the Tangle. And this works in a fundamentally different way from blockchain. They use what's called a directed acyclic graph. And instead of having blocks that are chained together, they basically have like a bunch of nodes. And all these things are constantly interacting with each other at all times, right? So think about this and then think back to what I was talking about with the machine-to-machine economy. In other words, every single device that's connected to the network can serve as a node, which means that you could process transactions and receive transactions. So on the IOTA network, which is highly theoretical, by the way, they still have yet to kind of prove this concept, but on this network, the idea is that there will be infinite scalability. And the reason this is the case is because for every transaction you make, you must also process 2 transactions. So when we talk about Ethereum, I've mentioned the scaling problem quite a few times. Right now it's too slow, it's too expensive, and they're working on solutions that are going to scale the platform, exponentially. But this concept is very fascinating to me because it still uses that proof of work concept, but has broken it up significantly. So every node, every user on the network is participating. They transact, they process 2 transactions, and they verify they're one. So the idea is that as the network grows, the more secure it becomes, and it scales continually as more devices are added to the network, right? So this is really cool. You're talking about an entirely new type of economy where data is no longer held in those centralized authorities. People now own their data again and can sell it and do whatever they want with it. IOTA also talks about some really interesting things like selling your excess power. Let's say you have a solar panel on your roof and you've got maybe it's a Tesla charger or whatever. As a community, as a neighborhood, you guys can get together, you can pull together your resources, pull together that power and sell it to people who need it if you've got extra. And you can, all that will be automatically processed on the network. So it's really, really fascinating to think about how things could change in this regard. Then in that case, you might not even need the DWP or a centralized authority to tell you that you have or don't have power. It might just be this mesh flexible network that continually changes and grows. So outside of the machine-to-machine economy, we could be looking at entirely new applications for all kinds of things. And this could be social media, gaming, organizational governance, meaning that we might have different kinds of companies. Right now we have companies with C-suite executives and directors and, board of directors, stuff like that. you could have an organization that is just run by the community, run by the token holders. People vote, people suggest proposals, and then things change that way. This is already happening with stuff like Uniswap, which is super cool. Data storage. The new infrastructure will support an entirely new type of cloud storage. This is also already happening with projects like Filecoin or SIA. And basically, you can reserve a portion of your data inside of your hard drive to store something for somebody else. Essentially, if you work with something like SIA, you can basically say, all right, I want to dedicate 1 terabyte to the cloud storage, and you're going to get paid out in SIA coin for holding that data. You now have just turned your empty hard drive space into a monetization method. That's crazy. So the concept is really that we can turn these things that we already have, the things that we already use and own, and make them work for us. Another one is cloud computing. So there are projects like Golem that are essentially a pooled network of computing resources. So if you, let's say you have a file or a render of an animation that you want to get done really quickly, you can buy computing power from the network and get that done faster. So now we have turned both my free storage in my hard drive and the computational power of my computer into money. There's no way to do this right now. It's simply impossible. It would be far too expensive and cumbersome and inefficient. But there is a new way to go about this. I didn't really touch on these two, but I'll come back to them real quick. Gaming, stuff like NFTs are really, really cool, and the metaverse. You know, we talk about things like the Ready Player One Oasis and how it's, you know, some people would think that's really cool. I think it's really cool. But in that context, you know, everything in the Oasis is built, used by the players, by the developers, and then traded for real world assets. One of the concepts in that book is that money in the game has become worth more than the money in the real world. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but this concept is starting to be built out. Some people are building platforms kind of like Roblox or Minecraft that are open source and saying, come build assets on our network. Come build stuff. Come build a world. And you can buy and sell and trade those assets, which I think is really, really awesome. I mean, you could have a theoretical, you know, let's say it's a MMO RPG, and you as a individual might make a living by creating assets and selling them. Maybe you're an artist that you want to sell inside of a game. And I think that's really cool because games don't really allow for that right now. They're all centralized and controlled by the companies and the developers. This gives a lot more freedom to people to participate in how the games are developed. Some games are even just creating like a world and saying, come build a game inside of our world, which is super cool. And then, of course, social media, stuff like Peep.eth. You know, this is basically a Twitter clone on the blockchain, but one that's censorship resistant and kind of operates in a different way. So you could start to see more social media types kind of come out using this technology. So, simply speaking, we have a potential for a brand new internet supported by a peer-to-peer network, one that isn't really owned by anybody. So you can kind of think like Silicon Valley, if you guys watch the show. You know, their big concept is build a new internet, one that's peer-to-peer and connected from basically any device with a chip in it. It's kind of like what IOTA is trying to accomplish in a similar way. And I think stuff like Starlink, what Elon Musk is proposing and actually doing, which is, you know, putting satellites in space to give the world, the globe, access to internet, it's just going to accelerate this stuff. And I think that's going to contribute to the backbone of all of this, right? So once this infrastructure is built, the sky is really the limit. I think this will lead to rapid adoption of cryptocurrencies and different blockchain technologies. I mean, this concept alone would attract so many people. I mean, if I told people that you could earn even just 5% annually on your savings, why not? Why wouldn't everybody flock to this? Obviously right now it's difficult because there are still exploits and still problems with the smart contract. We're still prone to human error. But as we start to mitigate those concerns and get better and grow, once this stuff is hopefully foolproof, I don't see any reason for people not to jump ship. I think that this is the natural evolution of society, really. As we become a more globalized race of humans, we will need stuff like this, right? So I'm really encouraged about the future of this technology and this new infrastructure that's being built. I think that we're going to see all kinds of stuff that we wouldn't even have thought of. I mean, last night I was doing research on NFTs and the metaverse, and I learned about a project called NBA Top Shots. And they're basically producing like digital cards, trading cards, but also digital moments in history. So there might be a theoretical future where you can own a moment in history, and maybe there were only 10 versions of those, and you can store that in a digital poster on your wall or something like that and show that you're the owner of that. It's a very strange concept, but I think that there is a lot of power there. People like to own rare goods, so giving people rare goods that you can put on display and share with people, I think, is a fascinating development in this scene. So that is pretty much all I got on infrastructure inversion and blockchain. So hopefully you guys have learned a little bit about how this stuff is really going to change how we operate as a society, and I'm really excited to see it all happen. Next time, we're going to be talking a little bit about the US dollar and how that's been manipulated over time, and kind of how we arrived to where we are. So thank you guys all for joining me today. I hope you guys enjoyed the talk. I will be back next week, and I'm going to stick around for a little while if you guys have any questions or anybody wants to just chat. But this is going to be it for the podcast version of the show. Thank you guys all again, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.